if your solution story collapses without your, without your product at the center, you're not selling solutions.
Welcome, my lovely people, to yet another fabulous episode of the B2B Sales Trends Podcast. Today, we're asking a super interesting question. What happens when a sales organization says it sells outcomes, but still thinks like a product company? That tension that sits at the heart of my conversation today with Michael Oren, who is the Senior Vice President of Americas Sales at Dematic. And Michael has been previously the EVP, Executive Vice President of Sales at Xerox. But what matters isn't really all the fancy titles and all of that. It's that Michael has lived through multiple ways of commercial reinvention, from products to solutions to services to outcomes inside real organizations with real customers and, of course, with real consequences. In this episode, we'll explore what it actually takes to lead that shift, not as a methodology, but as a mindset change that ripples across people, incentives, and belief systems. Welcome to the B2B Sales Trends Podcast, Michael.
Thanks for having me, Harry. It's excited to be here.
Let's set this up. Before we dive into it, Michael, give us a bit of an intro about yourself. Tell us about your journey and how you got where you are today.
Absolutely. Well, I started my career knocking on doors selling copiers. Back in the day when you had to print off MapQuest directions to get to your next sales call. I joined Xerox right out of college. I joined them largely because of the sales training. It was a place that was known for building strong commercial leaders. And I didn't realize at the time how much that environment would shape, how much I think about selling. Right. But over the course of the next 2 decades, I moved from individual contributor roles into senior leadership, leading multi-billion-dollar P&Ls, first at Xerox and more recently at Dematic, who's a global leader in warehouse automation. And along the way, I kept getting pulled into moments where the way that we sold had to change. That was either driven by customer needs or competitive pressures or margin realities that were forcing our organizations to evolve. And so, as you mentioned, that meant moving from products to solutions, from solutions to enterprise and strategic selling, and ultimately to services-led, software-driven, outcome-based models.
Right.
In my last role at Xerox as EVP of our global services business, that translated into launching more than 100 print and digital service offerings globally and building the go-to-market motions that really were required to support them. So you can say, I guess, I didn't set out to be a transformation or a servitization leader. They weren't necessarily career goals for me, but they certainly became the through line of the leadership success that I've found as I guided teams across offerings and channels and industries through that change. And that's what I'm really excited to talk about today, is what it actually takes to move from selling things to being accountable for those results.
Let's talk about that to kick this off with. As you mentioned, you've worked inside organizations that moved from what you just said, from selling products to being accountable for outcomes. Now, when you look at sales organizations today, not necessarily your own, but generally, where do you see the biggest disconnect between, let's say, how these organizations think they sell and how customers actually experience that?
It's a good question, and there's a reality behind it. I think of it as that like promise, reality gap, that distance between how companies think they sell and how the customers actually experience the work. And I'll tell you about an experience maybe as a sales rep to kick off and then now some reflections that I've had as a leader since then.
Right.
But I got to, take you back to the early 2000s in my career. I remember it fairly distinctly, kind of this shift at an annual sales kickoff where we were told we're no longer selling products, we're selling solutions, multifunction devices. They're going to print, copy, scan, fax, etc. And they beefed up pre-sales. They enabled modular configurations. They gave us sales training. And they told us that we needed to shift from selling to procure. Instead of selling to procurement, we needed to start calling on IT. And at the time, my title even changed to Solution Sales Executive.
Interesting.
And these things change because a company's vision changes. And the challenge, I think, here is that commercial organizations will adopt the language of a sales motion that aligns to that vision, whether that's solution selling, strategic selling, or outcome selling. They train their sales teams and they think, great, our sales force is using the tools. They now have been trained and they have the skill sets. We've changed. But the reality is that what often happens is that the language changes faster than the organization, right? So you can rebrand the sales motion, but the operating model has to change enough behind the scenes to change the customer experience. Right. So sellers may end up selling ahead of that curve and promising solutions that become evident in post-sale and delivering on the commitments, or consistently at least delivering on those commitments. I ran, head first into that reality as a salesperson, as a solution sales executive. I remember coming out after that training, getting on my first call with a CIO, which felt great about. Training was great. I had a great solution and was engaged with that CIO. And I remember one of the first things that came up was the questions like, okay, this is great, but who installs it? Who secures it? Who manages the drivers? Who's going to manage the firmware updates? Who's going to support the users? And I didn't have an answer for it. I was like, well, it's very configurable. And so the CIO just very quickly realized, okay, so my team does that. That doesn't sound like a solution, right? That sounds like a lot of extra work that their IT organization at the time didn't have time for. And I probably went back to calling on procurement the very next day to try to work around some of those IT objections. But again, this happens all the time. There's a disconnect between the selling motions and reality. We sell solutions, but it's like IKEA sells furniture, right? Great product, but the assembly is on you. Or we're a consultative selling organization as long as the answer involves our own solution. Right. Or we're strategic partners, but we are only strategic once a year at the QB or, quarterly at the QBR and once, again at the renewal time frame. So, you almost have to laugh about it. But, that biggest disconnect, again, I think comes from companies that think that they're selling solutions that solve a customer problem where the customer may experience that the product or solution actually creates additional work that they're going to have to manage. Right. And that creates distance between that selling motion and the things that customers actually experience.
Yeah. Hey, a quick pause here, because if you're leading a sales team right now, you will want to hear this. We've just released our new report, the 26 Sales Trends for 2026. It's pulled from the conversations we've had with senior leaders on this very podcast. The themes, the shifts, and the realities shaping how customers buy and how teams need to sell in the new year. It's practical, it's concise, and it's built to help you make better decisions faster. You can download it for free at the link in this description box or at globalperformancegroup.com. Now, let's get back to the conversation. It's a really good one. A lot of the times, organizations says, well, we're already doing that. We already sell a solution that you've shared earlier. From your experience, what what is a flag to you that shows that people are still operating with a product mindset, even though when the language sounds sort of the same or, modern? What have you seen, and you shared an example, but generally for sales organizations, what have you seen where this sort of, this mindset or this language still says that, but how they're executing it is such a red flag, and not actually delivering on what the language internally says?
It's tricky. It's tricky because it's not always obvious from the inside. I believe that it shows up the fastest when you listen to customers, maybe versus the salespeople, or between what customers talk about their experiences as, and watching what the sales organization optimizes and measures and tolerates. But you can hear it as a signal, I think, in the selling motions, and you can kind of test for it in what salespeople know by heart. I mean, early in my career, and I can tell you this because it was drilled into me, from 20 years ago, but I could tell you that a, 3535 color MFD had front to back registration of plus or minus 5 millimeters.
Right.
I could have told you that because it was really product oriented selling. What I couldn't have told you though at that time was how much downtime that product would have caused a customer, or what it did to their workflow, or whether it, mattered to their business at all. And so, that's a product mindset, clearly. I mean, deep technical knowledge, very little connection to the customer impact. And, I think where that gets tricky is you can still have conversations about uptime and, reliability and outcomes, but it gets reconnected back to the product or framed as a product problem.
Right.
The solution-oriented mindset sounds different. It shows up when sales can describe a workflow, where that workflow breaks, how different parts of the operation depend on each other, and kind of why fixing that problem or those problems can actually change outcomes for the customer's business.
Right.
So, when, I go on sales calls and I'm listening for that, and salesperson says, "Hey, walk me through your requirements. Talk to me about, what's modern sales, like you said in the language, throughput, uptime, integration points,
right,
security standards. Based on that, we're going to configure this solution for you." But what's like really happening, and even just the framing of that, is the problems being framed through the lens of the product. And so if the customer says something like, okay, but our real issue is order variability,
right,
that's killing our operations, a product salesperson might respond more in a way that says something like, well, our system or our product or our solution supports really high variability. Here are the specs and the models and the configurations that address that.
Yeah.
Right? That's that product-oriented, feature functionality coming through. And I think what a true solutions or an outcome-based seller does is really digs into understanding and breaking down, what's in that workflow today? Where does the variability show up? Is it in the labor? Is it in the inventory? Is it in the process? What happens if nothing changes? That focus is on process, on dependencies, on consequences, and you can hear it, over time, as you're listening to some of your sales calls. So that sellers going to talk about the problem and really explore the problem in the workflow before they're talking about the technology and the solution. So maybe the bottom line for me is that if your solution story collapses without your, without your product at the center, you're not selling solutions. You're selling products with customizations around them. Right? Product companies that, quote unquote, sell solutions still optimize around what they sell, and solution sellers are really optimizing around what the customer is trying to fix.
Yeah. And those things, and I agree with what you said. Most of the people and most organizations intellectually agree with that, right? To stick with our terminology, we call it outcome-based selling. That's one thing to get it in your head, right? To understand it intellectually and agree with it. Practically, to execute it, people struggle with it, though. We see that every day in our day job. Where do you see the most sort of resistance when it comes to engaging based on outcomes? Where do you see that resistance to show up to that new conversation? And what's really sort of sitting underneath that resistance, in your opinion?
Resistance, I think that there's an ambition to sell in that manner. Mm-hmm. Typically, from a resistance perspective, it's teams are having to negotiate risk. They are negotiating risk connected to the solution itself, connected to the operations behind it. Oftentimes, early in the launch of the service, I saw that because they didn't have data to support that, or we didn't have enough customer base and experiences and data connected to those customers to support risk within those negotiations. So we might have solution architects that are over-engineering to de-risk the solution. You might have operations that wants standards and not, custom SLAs, and so they're negotiating back to the standards versus kind of solving really for that customer challenge. It's going to be square peg, round hole. Meanwhile, you've got sales kind of in the middle of these negotiations for the first time, and they feel like they're having to do more of a job maybe internally selling than externally selling. And, as a result, kind of early in those processes, you may end up with undocumented assumptions that everyone is trying to use to baseline those risks. And therefore, early launches of services may not drive great customer experiences, which drive more friction in the flywheel and those emotions across the different functions within the organization.
Let's talk about the leadership aspect of that shift, if we may. I know you've seen quite a bit in your previous roles and in your current roles in relation to that. What belief did you personally have to unlearn as a leader to fully embrace that sort of mindset and skill set of outcome or solution-based thinking?
I think maybe early in my career, I thought that, you could create value through the sales motion. Like if we built the right thing and we delivered that thing well, value is going to naturally flow. It doesn't. At least not anymore.
I agree.
And I think that that's the hardest belief to unlearn, is that value lives in what we sell. And outcome-based thinking, that value only exists when the customer achieves something meaningful. So at some point as a leader, you realize you don't win necessarily because your product or solution is great, but we win because the customers that we have perform better. And that realization changes how you invest and how you measure success and how you lead teams, and it has quite an impact on your thought process.
Yeah, I agree. And as a leader, you've obviously been in environments where similar implementation timelines stretch a long time, sometimes years, not necessarily always months, so a long time. How does that reality change what success looks like for salespeople and how leaders should be thinking around measurement and accountability in relation to that topic?
At Xerox, implementation timeline was long. At Dematic, it's much longer. I mean, we're talking about implementation cycles where you're engineering automation for an entire warehouse infrastructure that could take several years. I think that, the question about accountability, who's accountable for what, is a tough one the longer that really stretches out. I don't think that leaders should hold sellers accountable necessarily for operational execution when it's that long of a time, but they should hold them accountable for how outcomes were framed, whether value was baselined,
right,
whether or not success metrics were agreed to, and whether or not delivery teams were set up to win. So that challenge with multi-year implementation timeline really changes. Really is challenged because business changes over the course of a couple of years in ways that you can't necessarily predict.
Right.
So, I'm a business. I think my trajectory over the next 2 years is going to look like, X or Y. And then all of a sudden we've got, a new administration. We've got tariff challenges that change supply chain requirements, right? I mean, things happen, right? That the right shift, though, as you're thinking about accountability, is I think to governed adaptability. So teams can't pretend like change didn't happen or just try to quietly absorb it and keep things moving. That's where you have breakdown occur and trust erode. I think that the teams that succeed are really the ones that are actively working together as a unit to talk about change early, tie it back to the outcomes and the assumptions that were made with the customer and keep them focused on those outcomes and what that change means to them as a part of the project or the solution that's being sold. And so you can't measure success, based on whether or not, nothing changed. You have to measure it on whether or not the outcome stayed clear,
right?
Even if that path to get there shifted,
right?
And that's to me that's the difference, Harry, between managing the project or an implementation and leading a partnership, which is what I hold sales accountable for.
If you were right now advising a commercial leader who might be listening to this today, what's one thing they should stop, start, and protect if they want to move towards an outcome-based selling motion without the chaos associated with it? One thing they should stop, one thing they should start, one thing they should protect to move towards outcome-based selling.
I would tell you, Harry, and you can feel free to cut this. I haven't thought long and hard about this answer, but maybe the first thing that comes to mind is kind of obvious to me, which is you really have to think deeply and differently about the customer challenge that you're solving for and understand that whatever you're selling them, kind of the domino effect that creates for them, and be thinking through the experiences that other customers have had to help forecast the challenges that you may be able to also help solve for.
Right.
It takes more time to do that. I believe that you need to empower teams to think creatively about how they solve for those solutions, because that solution may not be in a price list. It may not be listed as a services offering. And you have to have kind of the adaptability as an organization and flexibility as an organization to be able to address those customer needs and sign up for the risk and accountability of that outcome.
Right.
Sometimes that's going to mean longer sales cycles. And I think from a salesperson's perspective, as they're going through that shift, they have this dichotomy of, we need you to sell something now. It's the end of the quarter. You need to drive this. And you're going after volume. And that, on the other hand, you're elongating the sales cycle and having them think creatively. And that takes more time to drive the outcome. So I think that there can be confusion there, and there's a patience that's required to kind of manage through that chaos, and an empowerment into the sales organization to help solve for those challenges. And they have to solve for those challenges in partnership with operations, so that the promises that are made are the promises that are kept and that the customer experiences.
Yeah, interesting. If you'd have to describe modern B2B selling in one word, Michael, what would that one word be?
I thought about this one. I'd say if I had to describe modern B2B selling in one word, I'd probably say stewardship. Sales is a team sport now. When it comes to span of sales operations and customer success, no single function is going to have all the answers. I believe that the teams that win in modern B2B selling are the ones that stay aligned, the ones that adapt quickly, and the ones that own the customer outcomes together.
Right. Love it. Stewardship. Nice. How about the last question on every single podcast that we ask is, in your experience, what are the top 3 qualities that separate leaders who successfully guide that transformation from those who stall about halfway through? What are those top 3 qualities that leaders need to possess?
I think you kind of called out one of the challenges. I mean, most transformations don't fail at the start. They're going to kind of fail in the messy middle.
Right.
Everyone kind of gets aligned early to a vision. Energy's high usually at the start, but that real resistance, some of those friction points, show up when some of the easy wins are gone. So I think, leaders that make it through those transformations successfully maybe have 3 things in common. One is consistency. When the organization pushes back with this, incentive habits, short-term pressures, they don't change the message. They reinforce it. They reinforce it calmly. They reinforce it repeatedly. Maybe the second is courage, right? They're willing to make real trade-offs. They don't try to run necessarily the old model and the new one forever. They change the metrics. They change the funding. They change the roles.
Yeah.
They're adaptable. They accept some of the discomfort that comes with some of the ambiguity in the middle. And the third is patience.
Yeah.
Right? Transformation always seems to take longer, than creating PowerPoint slides, for sure.
Right.
Skills have to be built. They have to be, muscle memory and trust has to form.
Right.
That capability of the organization, and it's not just the sales organization, it's all of those functions have to, catch up and work in sync to align to the ambition.
Yeah.
So you can't necessarily declare victory too early, and a good leader isn't going to abandon that effort, even when progress is slower than they want it to be.
Consistency, courage, and patience. Love it. Michael, you've been a tremendous guest. Thank you for taking the time today. We appreciate your thought leadership and insights, and I know our listeners do so too. So thank you for your time.
Thanks, Aaron. It was a pleasure.
My lovely people, what really stood out to me today, or reviewing this conversation now with Michael, is how quietly demanding real change actually can be. Not really dramatic, not flashy, just a series of leadership decisions that ask more of people, or more of ourselves too. Because moving an organization forward isn't about announcing a new direction. It's a team sport, as Michael has put it. It's about what happens after the announcement, where really execution hits at the point of customer interface, when incentives don't light up yet, when old habits resurface, which they will, and when leaders have to hold the line long enough for belief to catch up with intent. Consistency, courage, and patience, as Michael mentioned, as the 3 elite leadership traits, and I truly believe that that's the case. These are the conversations that remind us why progress in sales and leadership is rarely about doing more and often about letting go of what no longer serves the customer or the organization. If this episode has sparked something for you, share it with somebody who might be interested in this topic. Is subscribe to it, whether you listen or wherever you listen, shall I say, so you don't miss any future conversations like this. You can find more insights, tools, and upcoming sessions at B2BSalesTrends.com and on our YouTube channel, B2B Sales Trends Podcast. My lovely people, until the next time, look after yourself, look after your loved ones, of course, and your B2B customers. All the very best. Bye-bye. If you'd like to put yourself or someone you know forward to be a guest on our show, there is a quick form in the show notes to complete. It only takes a minute, and it helps us to find voices and opinions that shape the future of B2B selling. Thank you. We appreciate it.